Hello, and welcome back to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain the Bible one chapter at a time. My name is Luke, and I am your host. Today's chapter, Genesis 17. Let's read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe, the follow button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 17 has 27 verses. Let's read. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her. She shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, No. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with you as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. That is the text of Genesis chapter 17. I just wanted to welcome everybody. For those of you who have been following along with every chapter, welcome. For those of you who may be joining for the first time, welcome. If you're here for the first time, you may not know about our PDFs that have outlines of all the key details of these chapters. You can get them on our website totally for free for all the chapters of Genesis at tobelikechrist.com. There's also a book available on Amazon that has them already printed off for you. In Genesis chapter 17, we have even more details about this promise, this covenant that God has made with Abraham. We're going to see some old information about those promises reaffirmed, but we're also going to glean some new information from the text that's in this chapter. There's going to be some things that God tells Abraham that he hasn't told him before about some of the conditions of this promise. For the sake of understanding the context, what we just read in chapter 17, let's look back at a couple chapters we talked about before. In chapter 12, we're introduced to Abram, We are told that he has been chosen by God to be the recipient of an incredible promise that has at least three parts. Number one, God's going to make him into a great nation of people. His descendants are going to be so many, you won't be able to count them. Number two, the second part of the promise, God's going to give this great nation that comes from him the land of Canaan as their homeland. Abram lives there now, but he doesn't own it. He's not the ruler of it. But eventually his people will make that their home and they will control it. And then number three, that all the nations, everyone on the entire earth is going to be blessed through Abram and the people that come from him. We talked about how that happens. It happens in Jesus as he's a blessing to the entire world, offering forgiveness of sins. That brings us to chapter 15, where we see Abram having some questions about how God is going to fulfill this promise. Years have gone by, and him and Sarai still don't have any children because Sarai is barren. She can't bear children, not a son, not even a daughter. Abram asked the Lord, he's like, how am I going to be a great nation? Is my household going to pass down representatively through my servant? He has this servant named Eliezer of Damascus. And God comes to him and he says, no, that's not going to happen. He reaffirms the promise to Abram, and then he tells him that the one who's going to pass down Abram's line is going to be indeed a biological son of Abram. That then brings us to chapter 16. A decade has gone by between God calling Abram from Haran and giving him these promises and the opening of the verses of chapter 16. A decade. That's a long time to wait for a promise. And guess what? Him and Sarai still don't have any children. And so Sarai kind of concocts this plan to bear a child representatively through one of her servants. She has this servant named Hagar, who's an Egyptian. She sends Abram into her servant to conceive a child so that at least, if nothing else, she could have a child through her servant, and Abram at least would have a biological heir. Well, Abram and Hagar are successful at conceiving a child, and they name him Ishmael. But this brings a lot of strife to Abram's household, and we're going to see even more strife in the future. So that brings us to the opening verses of chapter 17, and we're going to see if God is going to fulfill his promises through Ishmael and Hagar, through Hagar and Ishmael, or if he's going to do it another way. If maybe he had something else in mind this whole time, and Abram and Sarai kind of jumped the gun in coming up with this plan to conceive through Hagar. I think if you were with us for our last study, you're going to realize that, or you're already going to know that, yeah, they jumped the gun. Before we do get into chapter 17 to the actual text, let's talk about when the events happened. So Abram was born about 2,000 years before Jesus. The events that are recorded in Genesis 17 specifically happened when Abram was 99 years old. So we've skipped 13 years between the end of chapter 16 and now the opening of chapter 17. And this is now 24 years after God initially made Abram the promise. Okay, so keep all that in mind. As far as our characters today, I think we've introduced Abram sufficiently in previous studies and in what we've talked about already. And I think we also know who Sarai is. Those are our two main characters. We've got Abram and Sarai. They're married and they are chosen by God, uniquely chosen by God, to be the recipients of these promises. As far as our map and our where section today, where did these events take place? Well, we don't have much information here. God had a conversation with Abram in this chapter about the future of his family, but we're not told where exactly this conversation took place. I've got a map on our PDF, but there's not much to look at. Let's go ahead now and look at the text and break it down, understand what we just read. I've got our 27 verses broken down into three sections. The first is verses 1 through 14. God's covenant with Abram and the sign of circumcision. God speaks to Abram when he's 99 years old. The text indicates that God actually comes down in some kind of a visible form to speak with Abram, because the text at the end of the chapter says that God goes up from him. So evidently God's presence in some form is there with him, and he speaks with Abram. He's 99 years old at this point, and God reaffirms his promises to him. It's been 24 years, but God is still saying, I'm going to make it happen. I know I haven't done it yet, but it's still going to happen. God promised Abram that he would be the father of a multitude of nations. Okay, we've pretty much seen that promise a number of times before. And for that reason, though, God changes Abram's name to, can you guess? It's the name that I've repeatedly been using when I shouldn't have been because we hadn't gotten to this point yet. God changes Abram's name to Abraham. So if you're wondering why I kept calling him that, it's because most people, when they talk about Abram, they talk about him as Abraham because that's the name that we're going to know him by from this point forward. And he's given that name because he's going to be the father of a multitude of nations. The covenant, these promises that are made between God and Abraham, God says that they are going to be an everlasting covenant. Now, in what sense are these everlasting promises? Well, as we talked about, some of these promises are fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus dies for the sins of the world and offers forgiveness of sins. And that mercy and that grace, the fulfillment of this promise, is going to last until the end of time in the judgment day. So in that sense, in part, the promises made to Abraham are everlasting. They're going to be around as long as time is around. God says once again that he is going to give Abraham's descendants the land of Canaan, and that in exchange, the people who are Abraham's descendants, they are going to honor God as their God. They're not going to go off and worship pagan gods. They're not going to worship idols or other deities of foreign nations. No, the God of Abraham will be the God of his entire nation and all of these people who come from him. What we see next is a sign of the covenant. And this is a sign that Abraham has to facilitate. Abraham's descendants are going to be marked in a way. The reason for this marking is to mark them as God's special people who are inheriting these promises. The sign of the covenant was circumcision. Abraham was to circumcise all his future male children and every male who lived in his house at the time. Now, circumcision, that seems kind of a strange sign. Why does God choose this as the sign of the covenant? Well, we don't know all of the reasons for that, just as we don't know all the reasons that God chose Abram out of all the other people in the world. But this is what God selects, and this sign is supposed to be applied to all of the males that are currently under Abraham's roof. And I will stop here and make a comment about some New Testament books. If you've ever been reading the New Testament, which I would say more people probably read than the Old Testament, sometimes you'll come across authors of the New Testament, like Paul, who just seemingly randomly bring up circumcision. Like, you'll just be reading, talking about God's promises, about maybe how Christians should live together in harmony or something like this. And then Paul brings up circumcision. And you're like, what? Why is this here? If you don't know the Old Testament, you're going to be really baffled. And I mean, of all things to talk about, that's a pretty strange thing to bring up. So if you come to texts in the New Testament talk about circumcision, just keep in your mind that this relates back to the promises that God made to Abraham and the promises that God made to Abraham's descendants. So if Paul or somebody is bringing it up in the New Testament, they're likely it's in some way related to these promises and to God's unique relationship with these specific people. And that will help you probably to make some more sense of what's going on in those New Testament passages. But I just wanted to mention that because I've thought about that before. I thought, man, if anyone who didn't really know the book of Genesis came across this text, it'd probably be really, really strange. So there you go. That's my helpful tip for the day. We're also told that infants that were born in Abraham's house were to be circumcised when they were 8 days old. Now, this is really interesting. Why day number 8? We're not told specifically in this text why that was supposed to be the day, but we do find out something really interesting millennia later when scientists go and study the biology of infants. And I'll tell you before I tell you this, that I looked this up on several secular websites, not Christian websites, and they confirmed that this was true. I didn't know if it was just some, Christian myth that had been repeated over and over again, but it's not. It's actually shown through scientific tests, and even secular people acknowledge this. Why circumcise on the 8th day? Well, Abraham would have had no idea about this, but an infant's vitamin K peaks on the 8th day after birth. Now, why is that significant? Vitamin K has an impact on blood clotting and injury healing. Circumcision is a injurious bloody process. And so the body needs to be able to recover, especially if you're out in the wilderness and not in some modern hospital, like Abraham was, and all the children that were born, across these centuries. So they need their body to be able to recover. And guess what? It's on the 8th day that the body is in optimal conditions to do that. And so a lot of people look at this as a scientific evidence that the Bible is not just of human origins, but has supernatural origins. This brings us now to section number 2, verses 15 through 21. God promises Abraham and Sarai a son. So God told Abraham that Sarai's name was also going to be changed. It's going to be changed to Sarah because she was going to give birth to a son. She was not going to have this promise fulfilled through a representative son born to her servant Hagar. She was going to have a son of her own. God was going to make this happen. Her son would be the father of nations and kings of people. Now, Abraham's response to this is interesting. Abraham laughs at it. And he expresses his doubts. He's like, I'm 100 years old, and my wife, Sarah, is 90 years old. How on earth is she going to conceive a child? And the answer to that is she wasn't going to naturally conceive a child, but God was going to step in here and get the job done. But Abraham has some doubts, seemingly, and maybe he wonders how exactly to take God's words. Does God mean this literally, or does he kind of mean something else? And that might explain his next statement. From verses 18 and 19, it seems that Abraham may still believe that in some sense God is going to accomplish these promises through Ishmael. Let me read you verse 18 and the way that Abraham responds to God. And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." So God tells Abraham that he's going to have a son with Sarai. And Abraham's first response is about Ishmael. So it may still be that he believes that Ishmael is going to be the one who God uses. But what we see from God is a very flat no in response to that. Let me read you verse 19. God responds, God said, "No, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." So Abraham has some doubts. He laughs. He brings up their age. He brings up Ishmael. And God says, I'm not joking, right? You are going to have a biological son. Sarah is going to have a biological son. And together your son will be this father of many nations. God does confirm that he's going to bless Ishmael, just as he promised to Hagar when she was in the wilderness in the last chapter. So he says, I will bless Ishmael. You don't have to worry about him. But your son Isaac, who you are going to have with Sarah, it's through him that the everlasting covenant is going to be established and going to be accomplished. I think it's worth taking a second here to pause and to try to do our best to clarify something that is commonly spoken about, not only in the Bible, but also in Bible studies, in churches, even in the news. You very well might have heard of the nation of Israel as God's chosen people, God's special people. You might be wondering, why are they special? What makes them distinct from all the other nations of the earth? And this text helps us to understand where that distinction comes from. Here's a little bit of a teaser, but I think it's important for clarification. Abraham is going to have a son named Isaac, who we're reading about now. Isaac is going to have a son named Jacob. So where's this name Israel come from? Well, God is going to change Jacob's name to Israel, and it's from him that the nation of Israel grows. Jacob, or Israel, has 12 sons, which will become the namesakes of the 12 tribes of Israel, and then they'll grow into this great nation from that point on. So it is through them that God makes this special promise. He makes it through Abraham, but it's not going to be all of Abraham's descendants who are this special people chosen by God for the fulfillment of these promises. It's only going to be the ones who come through Isaac. So when you hear this term of God's chosen people, God's special people in relation to the nation of Israel, and that is a very biblical term, this is where it comes from. It's important for us to understand how it was given, what the significance of it is, and what God plans to do with these chosen people. And what he's planning to do is fulfill these promises and to bring about the Christ to be a blessing to the whole world. Israel were the chosen people of God because God selects them. And I also want to make another point here because I think it's something that a lot of people have questions about. Why does God choose Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, as his chosen people? Are they superior to everybody else? Do they merit it? Is this something that they just deserve because they're so righteous? Are they just so skilled, so superior to other people in some kind of way? Is that why God chooses them? I think the answer to that is no. We don't really know, and we are not really told why God chooses Abram and his children out of all of the other people that he could have chosen on the earth. But here's one thing that we can know, and we're going to come back to this in our application section, and that is that very often in the Bible, God does not choose people to use for his will because they are special, but rather they become special because God chooses them. And I think that's what we see in Abram. God selects him. Why? Is he a perfect man? Is he just the most righteous? Well, we've already shown that that's not necessarily the case. He's certainly not a perfect man. Why does God choose him? We're not told, but he becomes special to the world because of God's power working through him. We'll develop that a touch more in the application section. Before we run too long, let's go to our final section of chapter 17 and talk about Abram's household being circumcised. Ouch. This is verses 22 through 27. After speaking with God, we're told that God goes back up to heaven and he ascends from Abraham. Abraham then immediately, and this is real faith, this is real conviction right here. Abraham returns to his household and circumcises all the males in his house, including himself. We're told that Abraham is 99 years old and Ishmael is 13 years old when they are circumcised. So if you want to talk about working faith, faith that inspires action, you might want to preach a sermon on this type of faith. I mean, this is serious faith to do this to yourself when you're 99 years old. But you have to admire him. He's been waiting on this promise for 24 years. He's now been promised, wait one more year and you'll have a son. And he's still believing God after all of this time. And he goes back and he marks himself with the sign of the covenant before the fulfillment of the covenant arrives, right? I think that's pretty special. He marks himself in this permanent way as a recipient of a child, as a recipient of God's promises, even before he receives those promises. So we see an admirable faith and one worth mimicking in Abraham. So I think that will do it for our podcast in Genesis 17 today. Tried to be as concise as possible while also clarifying some future things that I think we need to at least lay the foundation of here as we cover these key details in these chapters in early Genesis. Let's talk about our application now before we finish up. This kind of relates to the conversation that we had about why Israel became God's special people. God loves to use unspecial and even sometimes incapable people to achieve great things. Abraham and Sarah couldn't naturally conceive children, but God used them to bring a nation of people who were going to be central to the redemption story, the story about how all the world is saved from sin and death. And I don't think that God did it this way unintentionally. He takes a barren woman who's 90 years old to start the nation that's going to help save the world. I think God wanted it to be very clear that from the beginning of this story, as we follow these people moving forward, it all began with God, and it's ultimately all going to end with God, and he's going to be the one who brings these really special things to fruition all along the storyline. It's not about human capability. It's not about what's possible for human beings. It's what God is going to do through these people. We're going to see this pattern repeated all throughout the Bible. And here's an application for us to think about. If you're going to accomplish great things in the kingdom of God, it won't be by your own strength and your own skill. It'll happen as a result of God's power working through you as you humbly submit to his leadership. As we mentioned, God doesn't choose people because they're special. He doesn't say, wow, I need someone who's really talented and really capable and really skilled. I need the best of the best, the cream of the crop of humanity because I have a big mission for them to accomplish. God doesn't choose people because they are special. They become special and accomplish special things because God chooses them and infuses them with his power. That's our Bible study in Genesis chapter 17 today. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow to study again and talk about Genesis chapter 18, continue following along with the story of Abraham and Sarai. We're now waiting for this next big event, which will be the birth of Isaac, their son.